time-lapse video, it looks like a monster coming alive. For a moment, it sits there, innocuously. Then, ripples move across its surface. It bulges outwards, bursting with weird boils. It triples in volume. Its color darkens, ominously. And its surface hardens into an alien topography of peaks and craters. Then, the kitchen timer dings. Your cookie is ready. What happened inside that oven? Don't let the apron deceive you. Bakers are mad scientists. When you slide the pan into the oven, you're setting off a series of chemical reactions that transform one substance, dough, into another, cookies. When the dough reaches 92 degrees Fahrenheit, the butter inside melts, causing the dough to start spreading out. Butter is an emulsion, or mixture of two substances that don't want to stay together. In this case, water and fat, along with some dairy solids that help hold them together. As the butter melts, its trapped water is released, and as the cookie gets hotter, the water expands into steam. It pushes against the dough from the inside, trying to escape through the cookie walls, like Ridley Scott's chest-bursting alien. Your eggs may have been home to squirming salmonella bacteria. An estimated 142,000 Americans are infected this way each year. Though salmonella can live for weeks outside a living body, and even survive freezing, 136 degrees is too hot for them. When your dough reaches that temperature, they die off. You'll live to test your fate with the bite of raw dough you sneak from your next batch. At 144 degrees, changes begin in the proteins, which come mostly from the eggs in your dough. Eggs are composed of dozens of different kinds of proteins, each sensitive to a different temperature. In an egg fresh from the hen, these proteins look like coiled-up balls of string. When they're exposed to heat energy, the protein strings unfold and get tangled up with their neighbors. This linked structure makes the runny egg nearly solid, giving substance to squishy dough. Water boils away at 212 degrees, so like mud baking in the sun, your cookie gets dried out and it stiffens. Cracks spread across its surface. The steam that was bubbling inside evaporates, leaving behind airy pockets that make the cookie light and flaky. Helping this along is your leavening agent, sodium bicarbonate, or baking soda. The sodium bicarbonate reacts with acids in the dough to create carbon dioxide gas, which makes airy pockets in your cookie. Now it's nearly ready for a refreshing dunk in a cool glass of milk. One of science's tastiest reactions occurs at 310 degrees. This is the temperature for Maillard reactions. Maillard reactions result when proteins and sugars break down and rearrange themselves, forming ring-like structures, which reflect light in a way that gives foods like Thanksgiving turkey and hamburgers their distinctive, rich brown color. As this reaction occurs, it produces a range of flavor and aroma compounds, which also react with each other, forming even more complex tastes and smells. Caramelization is the last reaction to take place inside your cookie. Caramelization is what happens when sugar molecules break down under high heat, forming the sweet, nutty, and slightly bitter flavor compounds that define, well, caramel. And in fact, if your recipe calls for a 350-degree oven, it'll never happen, since caramelization starts at 356 degrees. If your ideal cookie is barely browned, like a Northeasterner on a beach vacation, you could have set your oven to 310 degrees. If you like your cookies to have a nice tan, crank up the heat. Caramelization continues up to 390 degrees. And here's another trick. You don't need that kitchen timer. Your nose is a sensitive scientific instrument. When you smell the nutty, toasty aromas of the Maillard reaction and caramelization, your cookies are ready. Grab your glass of milk, put your feet up, and reflect that science can be pretty sweet.
I'm salivating just thinking about it. There's nothing quite like a fresh-baked cookie that we quite often enjoy in culinary arts. But anyway, so this is Chef Hawks again, speaking about chapter number 19, our introduction to baking. So we may have already done a little baking, but we're going to get much, much deeper into it. There's an awful lot of things to learn about baking. It covers a very, very wide range of different things. Here we go. So when we look at our ingredients that we use in most baked products, we're going to have some kind of fat or shortening. It could be butter or oils. We're going to have something to sweeten. It's going to be sugars, syrups. We're going to have some chemical, organic, or physical leavening going on. That's when we're talking about things rising. That can be baking powder, baking soda, yeast, and steam. Then we have thickeners. That can be cornstarch, flour, eggs, flavoring ingredients as well, extracts, spices, could be things like nuts as well. Then we've got liquids. That can include water, milk, cream, eggs, honey, molasses, butter. Yes, butter, because we can melt that butter. And then we have different additives like food colorings and artificial flavorings and various things like that. So what's the main ingredient in most baked products? Whether we're talking about pastries, cakes, cookies, most of them require a strengthener, something that gives stability. The main strengthener that's used, in our case, is generally flour. Wheat flour is the most popular used. So different types of flour have different strengths to them. The gluten is a protein, and the gluten that's in flour determines what type of flour it is. We're going to look at that in just a minute as well. If you have a look on the nutrition label, then it actually tells you how much protein's in there. It gives you an idea on the gluten level. So too much mixing, working, and kneading equals elastic and stretchy. So if we're making some dough for pastry and we overwork it, it can get really tough and it can shrink in that pie dish. Or if we're trying to make biscuits and we're over kneading it, then those biscuits are going to turn out tough. They're not going to be nice and light and flaky. We're going to talk more about that as well. So let's look at the different types of flour that we have.
Hey everybody, Thomas Joseph here. Now today I am super excited to share with you the most asked about question I'm going to say, and that is, what is the deal with all of the different flours out there in the supermarket? Which ones do I use when? Can I substitute them? All those sorts of questions. Well, today I'm going to answer them for you. I have a few varieties here in front of me, but before we get into those, I want to talk about wheat flour in general. Wheat. What is it? Well, wheat is, in the United States, probably one of the top 3 grains that are grown, and about 75% of the wheat grown in the United States is hard wheat, considered hard wheat, and 20% to 25% is soft wheat. Now, hard wheat has a higher protein content in it over kind of generally compared to the soft wheat, which has a lower protein content to it. Now, most flours that you find in the market are made of red wheat. There are many different kinds of wheat in the United States. There's red wheat, there's white, but the majority is red, hard wheat-based flours. So in front of me here, I have all-purpose flour. All-purpose flour, again, is made from that hard wheat. But the difference here is that in all-purpose flour, what happens is you take the wheat with its 3 components. The first is the endosperm, then there's the bran and the germ. Now, the endosperm is all that's left when you have all-purpose flour. The other 2 items are milled out of the flour, and that gives you something that's great for all sorts of items. That's why all-purpose gets its name. You can use it for biscuits, you can use it for breads, you can use it for pizza doughs, and the overall protein content of all-purpose flour is about 10 to 12%. So it kind of lives in the middle, maybe a little higher up on the protein scale, but it gives strength and structure, but it also has a certain amount of lightness to it for so many different things. And next to all-purpose, we have whole wheat flour. Now, whole wheat flour, it has that same endosperm in it that all-purpose does, but it also has the 2 other components of the wheat kernel. It has the germ and it has the bran. Now, different brands of flours will have different ratios of endosperm to bran and germ, but one thing that you'll notice is you'll notice a difference in color, right? Because it has more of the elements of the wheat in it, and this is made from a red, hard wheat, so it has kind of this brownish red color to it. Now, one thing you want to know about whole wheat flour is that it has a higher oil content in it than the all-purpose flour, and that's due to the wheat germ that's in here. Now, whole wheat flours, they add a lot of great fiber to whatever you're making with it, and oftentimes your baked items will be a little denser in texture, and so you sometimes want to mix all-purpose flour and whole wheat flour to get somewhere in between, something that's light and palatable, but also has great fiber to it. Now, a newer product on the market here is white whole wheat flour, and it's kind of in the name, it tells you what it is. It's actually a different type of wheat. So we were kind of talking about the red wheat, the red hard wheat. Well, this is white hard wheat. It's made from white wheat. So it has a lighter color, you can see, and the makeup might be slightly different just because it's a different product, but it still has endosperm, it still has the germ, and it still has the bran in it as well. So it has a lot of that fiber, but it's made from a different strain of wheat that's sold here in the United States. Next to this, I have something that a lot of people tend to buy, and sometimes they buy it and use it, and it's a mistake. It's self-rising flour. Self-rising flour has added leavener to it, so you have to be careful. Read your recipe before you use it. If it does not call for self-rising flour, if it just calls for regular flour, avoid using self-rising, because what's going to happen is you're going to have added leavener in your recipe, and your biscuits or whatever it might be are going to topple over because it's too much leavening for the recipes. Look in your marketplace, read your recipe, make sure that you are choosing the right flour for your recipe. Now, cake flour is a finer ground flour, similar to all-purpose flour, but what it has is a lower protein content in it, and that will yield a more tender, softer crumb to whatever it is that you're making. Now, cake flour has about 5 to 8% protein compared to the 10 to 12 that all-purpose has. Now, of course, you guys, every brand of flour has a different kind of makeup. That's what makes it unique. So these percentages might change slightly from brand to brand. So cake flour here, it has a lower protein content, around 5 to 8%, depending on the brand that you buy. And cake flour is good for not only cakes, but muffins, cupcakes, biscuits, and also scones. And something that I don't have here, but that is within this family, within this range, is pastry flour. It's used a lot in the food service and restaurant industry. Pastry flour has a little bit more gluten in it, so it has a little bit more strength to it, but it's also a finer flour, so it has about 8 to 9% protein, and it's used in a lot of pastries, pie dough, and things like that. So you get something that's sturdy and will hold its shape when baked like a pie shell, but will also be very tender as well. Now, going in the opposite direction, I have bread flour here. Now, bread flour, everybody these days is getting into making bread at home, and you need a good bread flour for that. Bread flour has a higher amount of protein in it, which that protein gives strength and structure to your bread, that chewiness that you want, and that really great crust. Bread flour has about 12 to 14% protein in the mix. So, if you're serious about bread making and you want to buy a good flour, make sure you look at the protein content of the brand that you're buying. As we shift down here, we're getting into a little bit more of boutique style flours. This is an Italian style flour. It's called 00 flour. And the 00 is in reference to the grind of the flour. So it's a very fine, powdery flour here. It still has a decent amount of protein in it, and it's typically used for pastas or pizza doughs. And what it does is it gives a nice silky texture to things like pasta, but it also maintains a bit of chewiness because it doesn't have a tiny, tiny bit of protein or gluten in it, so you still get that texture that you're looking for. Last but not least, this is called white lily flour. It's an actual brand of flour, and the one special thing about this flour here is that it uses a different type of wheat. Now, we've been talking a lot about the hard wheat varieties, and the majority of these flours are milled from hard wheat flours, but this white lily is actually made from a soft wheat, and that means that your final baked good is going to be very light, very tender, and usually it's used for biscuits and pie dough in the South, so things that are a little bit fluffier and lighter in texture. So there you go, guys, a really quick but I think informative guide to flours, why you might need them, why you need different ones. And when it comes to substituting them, to be quite honest, you have to be really careful because there are these variances in the amount of protein that each flour has, and they're ground at different levels, they have different fineness to them. You really should use the flour that's specified in your recipe.
So let's quickly do a recap. So all-purpose flour, as its name suggests, we've got something that's right in the middle here, something we can use for a large range of different things. Cookies, biscuits, and general production work making pastry. But also we can use this to make something like a pizza dough. It does have enough gluten to make something like that. Not necessarily a loaf of bread. It doesn't have quite enough strength in the gluten content for that. Then we look at bread flour. This does. So if you see the gluten that was in our all-purpose was between 10 and 12%. In strong flour, in our strong bread flour, this is where we have 12.5 to 13.5%. It may sound like only a few percent more, but in the volume of gluten that's in that flour, it's a significant jump up there. You can make things like bread and hard rolls that actually gives that structure to hold it all together and to give that structure that you enjoy chewing through on a piece of bread. Then we have cake flour on the opposite end of the spectrum, much softer, and that's specifically made for making things like cakes and delicate baked goods that you want to have that light, airy flakiness with it. That only has 7 to 9%. And durum flour. So durum wheat, this is a very hard wheat flour. This is 13.5 to 14% gluten content. So this is something that we can use. We're getting up there, so we can actually use for things like pasta as well, which requires a much stronger flour. And then we have pastry flour. So pastry flour was talked about in that video there. This is great for making cookies, pie pastry especially, because you want that light flakiness. You can make some sweet yeast doughs as well, biscuits, muffins. It really does have a very light flavor and texture to it. Got a nice creamy color, and then the gluten content on this one is between 9 and 10%. And then semolina flour. So it's a type of durum wheat, except for we coarsely grind this. So this is what you very often will find on the bottom of your pizza, is that they'll throw down some semolina so it doesn't stick. But this is used for pastas and Italian pastries in their production as well. About 13.5% or more of gluten in this. So let's now move on to fats and shortenings. So fats and shortenings add moisture and add flavor to our baked goods. It helps our baked goods to stay fresher for longer. We have to make sure that they are thoroughly mixed, that they're interspersed throughout the whole of our mix that we're using, because they will have an impact on the overall texture of that baked good. So sometimes we'll be rubbing the fats and shortenings in, sometimes we're cutting them in, sometimes we're rolling them in. It all depends upon exactly the method that we need to use, but this can create a nice flaky texture. And then we can also have it where we're creaming them in, and we're going to look at the different methods towards the end of this unit. We're going to look at the different methods of creaming and rubbing, cutting and rolling fats in, and the difference that it can make. So now I just want to show you a quick video here of making puff pastry. This professional pastry chef does an amazing job at it. This is a really difficult thing to be able to master, and so puff pastry is really significantly about the fats. Let's take a look.
Puff pastry dough is buttery and flaky and makes for such decadent baked goods, whether they be savory or sweet. First, I'll show you the technique of a real French folded puff pastry dough. The French method I'm showing you now has two parts to it, the barrage and the détrempe. I'm going to start by mixing the barrage. This is that hunk of butter that gets folded in layer by layer into the dough. So I've got 3 cups of unsalted butter, and I'll add 1 cup of flour. This makes this butter layer easier to handle as you start rolling it and folding it. Maybe a shocking amount of butter, but it is puff pastry for a lot of recipes. There we go. So this butter really doesn't change much in consistency, but because it's so soft, we have to chill it down so that we can handle it and work it into the dough. Now you need to let this chill until it's almost firm. So chill it for a couple of hours. Now for part 2 of the French puff pastry, and that is the détrempe. This is the body of the dough. So I start with 4 cups of all-purpose flour. And then a cup of cool water. And just a touch of sugar, 1 tablespoon. 2 teaspoons of salt. Then an important ingredient is a tablespoon of lemon juice. And now I'm switching to a dough hook because we really want to knead the dough. Now I can add the last element. Not as much butter as the barrage, of course, but half a cup plus an extra tablespoon at just about room temperature. And it takes about 4 minutes to really knead the dough. There we go. So the dough has come together. So I'm going to shape this into an 8-inch square. You want to give it at least an hour to relax. So I've got one already chilled. The method for this puff pastry is the French method, your 2 parts, your barrage and your doughy de trempe. The contemporary and modern thought amongst pastry chefs is to roll out the butter and put the dough in the middle. Makes for a more even and consistent pastry. So now I'm going to roll it lengthwise, about 20 inches across. And this is the first fold. Oh, this is why you need the big rolling pin with the handles on the outside. So at this point, it's a bit of work. Lift, make sure it's not sticking, and I do a 3-fold. So you fold it a third the way in, and now brush off this excess flour, and like so. So that's 1 fold down. You can usually get up to 2 folds each folding session without overworking the glutens. And there we go. So dust off the flour and the same 3-fold. I've exercised the dough enough that it needs to relax. You have to give the puff pastry at least 2 hours in between the rolls and folds for the butter to set. So back in the fridge it goes. It's really a simple case of repetition. Now you'll need to repeat this double roll and fold step once more, followed by a single roll and fold. But be sure you let the dough rest in the fridge for at least 2 hours in between. And this is a puff pastry ready to roll and use after it's had its 2 hours to rest and relax. But just to show you, so you can see, this is why it's worth the effort. Those beautiful thin layers of flour and butter ready to bake up and be flaky.
On to our next item that we use a lot in baking is sweeteners. So we have refined sugars, sugar syrups, molasses, brown sugar, corn syrup, honey, malt syrup. There are so many different types of sweeteners that we can add in here. They add flavor and color. They blend shortening with other ingredients. It helps to blend them all together. And also it produces a softer and more tender cookie or pastry item overall. Caramelization happens here when the heat causes that sugar to brown. Artificial sugars, artificial sweeteners, we should always be aware they will not caramelize, so you're not going to have the same result when you use those. Let's take a look at a few of these items. First of all, where do we get sugar from?
Cane sugar has been the sweetener of choice for over 2,000 years. It is used in all types of foods due to its versatility. It enhances flavor, aroma, texture, and browning. It also helps retain moisture and preserve freshness. Sugar starts with sugarcane, a tall tropical grass that can grow up to 20 feet high. When it is ready for harvest, the tops are removed, leaving the base stalks behind so they can grow into the next crop. Sugarcane is a renewable resource that doesn't have to be replanted to produce a new crop. After harvesting and transporting to the mill, the sugarcane is washed and cut into shreds. Next, huge rollers crush the cane, really hard. This mixture goes down to the separators, where the fibers are removed and the juice is sent on to the evaporators, which are basically huge pots heated by a furnace burning the dried sugarcane fiber. How efficient is that? This syrup is thickened by boiling off the water. Once the syrup is cool, it is time for it to be crystallized. To get crystals from the syrup, it is seeded with, well, crystals of sugar. Just a sprinkle is enough to kickstart the process. From there, it is moved into centrifuges, where centrifugal force squeezes out any remaining liquid, leaving, you guessed it, dry sugar crystals. Now the crystals are purified, decolorized, recrystallized, and dried in a large granulator. Next, they are sized by running them through a variety of screens, all to remove any impurities and make the sugar crystals just the right size and color. The end result is pure cane sugar. No bleaching or added chemicals required. Different types of sugar are created at various steps in this manufacturing process. Turbinado sugar has only been partially refined, and only the surface molasses washed off. Brown sugar contains some of the surface molasses syrup, which imparts that characteristic molasses flavor. Granulated sugar is the last step in the manufacturing process.
So if that's where sugar comes from, and we also get sugar beets as well, but if that's where sugar comes from and that's how we produce it, what are the different types of sugar we have as well?
Hi, and welcome to Top Stove with me, Culinary. Sometimes people ask me questions about sugar, like what's caster sugar and can I use this sugar instead of that sugar? So in this edition of Top Stove, I'll briefly describe to you some of the types of sugars that are commonly available in supermarkets and what you might use them for. I've got 7 different sugars here that typically you might find in a supermarket, and I'll start with these at the top. These 3 sugars are all unrefined cane sugars, and they're the natural sugars that you get from the juice that's extracted from sugar cane. This one is known as demerara or turbinado sugar. It's light brown in colour and typically crystalline. This one is a light brown soft cane sugar. It's very fine in nature. And this last one is muscovado sugar, and as you can see it's very dark. It's actually quite sticky as well. The brown colour comes from the naturally occurring molasses that's in the sugar, and there's typically between 5 and 10% by weight of molasses in these sugars. The demerara sugar has just a hint of molasses flavour about it, whereas the muscovado sugar does have a very distinct molasses flavour. There is another common unrefined sugar which I don't have here called jaggery, and it's typically found in Caribbean or Latin America, Africa and some parts of Asia. The great thing about these sugars is that they add a bit of flavour into whatever you're cooking, so they go really well in things like cookies or chocolate cakes or rich fruit cakes like Christmas puddings. These 3 white sugars are all obtained from refining or purifying the brown sugars that you saw earlier. So here I've got normal granulated sugar. This is caster sugar, or sometimes known as superfine sugar. And this is icing sugar or confectioner's sugar.
So the first step to making maple syrup is tapping the trees. This is their traditional way to do it with a spile and a bucket. In 2002, we got around to having 850 buckets, so that was getting a little time-consuming going to collect the buckets once or twice a day, and so we decided to modernize our operation and install pipeline and vacuum systems. These blue spiles here, they're actually called tree saver spiles. The hole is much smaller than a traditional spile. The tree ends up healing that same year instead of scarring over the years and causing damage to the trees, so this is a much friendlier way to tap the trees. So what you're looking at right now is a pipeline system. We currently have 4,200 taps. We're going to be expanding to 10,000 taps. All these pipes lead up to a main line, which brings the sap down to a storage tank. So the main lines I was showing you guys earlier all end up in this storage container here. We have a storage tank in here, our vacuum system, and an extractor. So the vacuum comes in through this PVC pipe here down to the extractor. This basically just keeps all the vacuum contained and pulls it through the main lines that we were showing you guys earlier. So the sap comes in through the main lines, fills these guys up, and then dumps it. At this point, the sugar content is about 1 to 3.5%. It still has to be refined to be turned into maple syrup.
Depending upon the flavor that we want, the sweetness that we want, we can decide what type of sweetener we want to use and what kind of end result we want to have. Now we're moving on to leaveners. Leavening agents can be either chemical, organic, or physical. So the leaveners help our dough or batter to rise. We have to measure these very carefully. Some of these things, especially if we're looking at chemical reactions, we only need very small quantities versus the actual volume of the product we're making to have a very big reaction.
Now we are currently on lesson 9 of the Baking Fundamentals course, and today we are going to talk all about leavening. Now if you've ever baked anything before, you're probably somewhat familiar with the concept of leavening, but today I want to dive in deep into what leavening actually is and all of the different ways our baked goods can be leavened. So leavening refers to the gases that are trapped inside of our baked goods as they are baked. Now this is what makes our baked goods rise, what makes them spread out, and also what keeps things tender and fluffy. Now there are 3 different categories of leavening used in baking. There is chemical leavening, there is biological leavening, and there is physical leavening. So let's review each type and how it functions in baking. So first let's talk about our chemical leavening agents, and these are baking soda and baking powder. Now the way these two things work is when they are added into our doughs and batters, a chemical reaction occurs that creates carbon dioxide gas. Now this gas gets trapped in our baked goods and what makes them rise. Now there is some differences between baking soda and baking powder. Now baking soda, which is also known as bicarbonate of soda or sodium bicarbonate, is alkaline on the pH scale. So in order for it to work and have that chemical reaction, it needs an acidic ingredient to react with. So a few common ingredients used in baking that are acidic include brown sugar, chocolate, buttermilk, molasses, and lemon juice. Now baking powder is actually baking soda already combined with another acidic ingredient. So when baking powder is hydrated, it already will begin reacting, and it can be used in any recipe because it does already have that acidic ingredient present in it. Now baking soda and baking powder work very quickly. They will begin producing that carbon dioxide gas almost immediately when they are hydrated, and so they need to be baked pretty much immediately after they go into a dough or a batter. Now I actually have a very detailed article on my website all about baking soda and baking powder and how they function in baking, so I'll leave the link for that for you in case you're interested. Now moving on to our next form of leavening, which is yeast, and this is considered a biological leavening. Now the reason why we call this a biological leavening is because it is actually a living organism. It is actually a fungus. Now the way yeast works is it feeds on sugars and starches present in the doughs or batters it's in, and as it feeds, it also produces that carbon dioxide gas as well as alcohol. Now this process of the yeast feeding and producing gases is called fermentation, and it is what makes yeast doughs rise. So in contrast to baking soda and baking powder working very quickly to produce the carbon dioxide gas, yeast produces this gas very slowly and over a long period of time. So in order for the dough to contain that gas, it needs to have a lot of structure and elasticity. So this is why yeast dough is needed over a long period of time to create that really strong and elastic gluten structure so that it can contain the gases that the yeast is producing. And you can actually see this in progress in this time-lapse video of my yeast dough rising. So what is happening is the yeast is feeding, it is creating those gases, and the dough is gaining volume, which is leavening the dough. Now this is called the fermentation process. So the last type of leavening is physical leavening. Now this is the type of leavening that happens just from air and steam. So air is used really frequently in baking as leavening, and you can most commonly see this by when you cream butter and sugar together. So this process of beating together solid fat with sugar traps tiny little pockets of air in between the ingredients. Now this pocket of air adds volume to our baked goods. Now you can also see air being used as leavening when you beat egg whites into a meringue or when you beat cream into whipped cream. Now steam is the other form of physical leavening used. Now the way this works is ingredients such as milk, butter, and eggs all contain water, and that is going to evaporate in the oven, causing steam. Now this might not seem quite as exciting as the chemical reaction that happens with baking soda and baking powder, but actually when water turns to steam, it increases in volume by 1,500 times. So it can really produce a great deal of volume in our baked goods. Now, one of the best examples of how steam is used as leavening in baking is with puff pastry. The way puff pastry is made is with many alternating layers of dough and butter. So when that dough is baked, all of the water that is present in the butter is going to evaporate off, which creates a great deal of volume and puff to the puff pastry. Now, another example of this is when making a Dutch baby pancake. So if you've ever made one before, there is no chemical leavening in it, no baking powder, no baking soda, but there is a great deal of liquid in the batter. So when this batter hits a very hot oven, it's going to quickly evaporate off, and you can see here the great amount of puff that happens when this Dutch baby is baked.
Just to reiterate then, so baking powder is a chemical leavener, right? It's one of our two. So we have baking powder, which is actually baking soda with an acid. That's generally cream of tartar. We've also used that when we make meringue as well. It helps to stabilize our egg whites when we make meringue. But that by having that combination of the baking soda and the acid, the cream of tartar, in our baking powder, it helps to rise. It creates carbon dioxide gas, and it helps our products to rise. It actually takes the heat and the liquid to make that leavening to occur. Baking soda, on the other hand, is without that acid being already in there. So this is another chemical leavener, but baking soda, it's also called sodium bicarbonate, produces carbon dioxide when you have liquid and an acid involved. So that acid could be vinegar, it could be wine, it could be cream of tartar. Depends on what you want to specifically add in, depending on what the recipe calls for. But this will again cause that batter to rise. Heat is not necessary with baking soda, with sodium bicarbonate, to get that reaction. Just to get the liquid and the acid in there. You need to bake it immediately though. That reaction happens immediately. It is not a long-lasting one like baking powder, which is much longer lasting. And we talked about physical leaveners. So this is where you are physically doing something with your product there to add in the air into that batter. So using the creaming method, the foaming method, we're going to talk about those in just a few minutes. But basically where you're whipping fats and sugars together, or eggs, if you're whipping those as well, it adds more air into there. These are all things like angel food cake, meringues, souffles. These all create the ability to leaven, to have them expand. And then steam, of course, as well. If we've got various different things like butter and eggs, they all have water content to them. They will actually create steam as that evaporates off when these baked goods are baking in the oven. Then we've got our slow-moving but rather tasty leavener, yeast. So you can see over on the right-hand side, and there's a couple of different methods that we can get it in. We can have fresh, which comes in that lump kind of format. You just break off pieces, or you can have dried. And so by using this, these are microscopic fungi that we're actually using. The yeast is, and so by using this, by activating it, and by using it in our products, it starts to also produce carbon dioxide gas, as it starts to live, as it starts to react to life in general, and that will create a rising agent in our dough. The benefit of this way is also that it creates more flavor in certain things as well. But the downside on this is that we have to treat it very carefully because it needs appropriate temperatures. It likes to be warm and moist. It does not like to be dry and either too hot or too cold. Otherwise, the yeast literally either dies or goes back to sleep again. So we can look at thickeners now. So when we're looking at thickeners, this may be for certain different types of products we're going to use in baking. We can use gelatin, which is animal-based. We can use flour, arrowroot, cornstarch. Those ones are all starch-based. And then we have eggs, which is a protein-based thickener. Kind of like when we made ice cream, and we cook the ice cream up to 170 Fahrenheit, and it starts to thicken. And that's exactly the type of thing that's occurring there, is that it's a thickener. So depending on the consistency that we want that finished product to have will depend upon what type of thickener we're going to choose to use. Then we have our flavorings. So it can be things like cocoa, spices, salt, nuts, and various different extracts as well. So we could be using spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, mace, cloves, ginger, caraway, cardamom, allspice, anise, poppy seeds. These all add flavor to the various different baked products. Salt also enhances the flavor and improves the texture. It can also control yeast fermentation. Be very careful not to add your salt directly on top of your yeast if you're making baked goods, because it can actually stunt their growth. And then you have extracts, things like flavorful oils. You've also got things like vanilla bean, lemon, and almond. And you've got, but also measure those very, very accurately. They're very, very strong extracts. So you generally are using fractions of a teaspoon of these items at times, because you don't want to use too much. Otherwise, it's going to overpower the product that you're making. And then we have liquids. So what kind of liquids do we use in baking? Water, milk, cream, molasses, honey, vegetable oils, and butter. So this provides moisture to our baked goods. It also helps the gluten to develop if we're looking to develop our gluten in certain products as well. And water is very common and very basic, but then you have things like the milk and milk products that we have in this list, which add more flavor and some nutritional value and texture to those goods as well. So now let's get into a little culinary math.
Standardized recipes for bakery products are called formulas, and they are set up a bit differently than those for other food items. Proportions for each ingredient are given in the form of percentages. A percentage indicates a part of the whole. For example, a pie with 4 pieces is divided into quarters. Each slice of the pie is 25% of the pie. 2 slices, half the pie, is 50%, and 3 slices is 75% of the pie. The entire pie is 100%. In baking, flour always has a proportion of 100%, and the percentages of all other ingredients are calculated in relation to the flour. These are known as baker's percentages. Because of this, pastry chefs can convert recipes to give larger or smaller yields by changing the ingredients' amounts while keeping proportions and percentages the same. It's also important to remember the amounts you will use to figure the amount of a particular ingredient will always be in pounds. Using this recipe for white bread, let's figure the percentages for the formula. When using baker's percentages, the flour is represented as 100%, and all of the other ingredients are expressed as a percentage of the flour's weight. To determine the percentage of the other ingredients, divide each one by the weight of the flour, and then multiply the rest, which is in decimal form, by 100 to convert to a percent. For example, to calculate the percentage of water, divide 33 by 50, and then multiply by 100 to get 66%. You would do the same with the salt and yeast to figure the percentage. Using a formula for ciabatta bread, let's figure the pounds needed for the formula. You decide to use 10 pounds of flour. To obtain the weights of the remaining ingredients, first divide the percentage by 100 to obtain a decimal. Then multiply the resulting decimal by the weight of the flour. So to figure the pounds of water needed, divide 73 by 100, and then multiply by 10 to get 7.3 pounds. You would do the same process for the salt and the yeast. There are times when you may need to recalculate the size of a formula in order to make either more or less. By using baker's percent, this is quick, accurate, and easy. Let's say you are given a formula for country French bread, which makes 201.9 pounds of dough. Instead of needing that much dough, you only need 150 pounds. How can you recalculate the formula to obtain 150 pounds of dough and keep the percentages? The first step is to determine the formula conversion factor. This can be established by adding all of the percentages of the formula, which in this case total 168.25. Then divide our new desired dough weight by the sum of the percentages. So 150 divided by 168.25 is 0.8915. The number should be rounded up to the next highest figure, so 0.9. Now, multiply each of the percentages by 0.9 to get the weight needed. For example, for the flour, we would multiply 0.9 by 100 and get 90 pounds. The same is done for each of the other ingredients.
Now we're going to move on to looking at a few other different baked goods. So cookies are an extremely popular type of one, but there's an awful lot of different types of cookies. And so these are generally a sweet baked food, using flour as the strengthener and sugar as our sweetening agent. They're normally small, flat, and round, but they can be different. So generally we are creaming these. It depends on how far we want that cookie spread during baking as to how much we're creaming. And we're also looking for good consistency and shape in all of our baked products, but especially cookies. We want to make sure that they're baked nice and evenly. They have a good similar look, so we've got consistency along our line. We can be very decorative with our cookies as well, make them look really appetizing. So we have to be very careful when we're using our ovens. Different ovens have different styles, but convection ovens actually can create a lot of air movement throughout there. So we want to make sure that we have the appropriate type of oven to cook our cookies in. Looking at a few different varieties here, we have bagged cookies. So this is where we are forcing a soft dough through a pastry bag. It's nothing to do with preservation, it's to do with production. Don't be thinking a bagged cookie is something you put into a bag. This is where we're actually forcing it through a pastry bag. So you make things like ladyfingers, macarons, these you see in the picture right here, and then tea cookies. Drop cookies are as they sound. You generally have a soft dough and you're literally spooning out or scooping out with a portioning scoop certain volumes of each one, and you're just dropping them straight onto the pan. And as they bake, they will spread into their appropriate round shape. Very often chocolate chip cookies and oatmeal raisin cookies are in this category. Then you have molded cookies. This is a stiffer dough where you're actually mixing it by hand. Things like peanut butter cookies are a good example of this. We have bar cookies. This is where you have bars where you actually create long sheets of this kind of cookie, and you're actually going to cut it into these individual bars from that dough. When you're slicing them into these individual bars, then it creates a good side effect, so you can see laterally across the actual product and the products that are in there, things like raisins and things like that. This is used for biscotti. Then we have icebox cookies. So icebox cookies, this is where you're going to be creating effects like the one you see in the picture above, where you're actually rolling the dough into a log. As you can see, we took two different pieces of cookie dough here. We colored one with the red coloring and laid that on top, and then we rolled them one over on the other, so that we create this roulade effect that you can then take out from the icebox and you can slice it to create this really cool pinwheel kind of shape. This is used for making things like butterscotch icebox and chocolate icebox cookies. Then we have rolled cookies. This is where you have a good stiff dough that once it comes out of the refrigerator, you can actually roll it out with a rolling pin and actually cut them into certain shapes as well. So when you're going to be using decorated sugar cookies, shortbread, these types of things. Then we have sheet cookies. So sheet cookies is where you're going to have a pouring batter into a baking pan, and then you're going to serve individual squares or rectangles from that overall sheet pan of cookie dough that you poured in. This is used for things like brownies, butterscotch brownies, or blondies. So as you can see right here, you may be thinking that brownies are more like a cake. We categorize them in the culinary world as a type of cookie. Now we're moving on to quick breads. What is a quick bread? So a quick bread is any baked good that we're not using a leavening agent by yeast or eggs. So we're using specifically chemical leavening agents. So we're using sodium bicarbonate, or we're using baking powder. And so here we're quite possibly making things like biscuits, muffins, scones, banana bread, soda bread, pancakes, and waffles. So we have 3 different methods that we use when we're making these quick breads. We have the creaming method, the muffin method, and the biscuit method. So the creaming method is when we're taking the fat, we're creaming it with the sugar first. You're going to need an electric mixer with this, with the paddle attachment that you can see in the photograph here. So you need a little bit of strength here to be able to start breaking these down to cream these two together. You mix them until they're creamy. This actually adds some air into the mix as it starts to create air pockets inside the butter. So this is used for things like chocolate chip and raisin spice muffins. Let's take a look at this.
And today we're going to talk to you about what is the creaming method. Now, this is a very common method used in baking, and it's used in cookies, cakes, muffins, all kinds of baked goods. And essentially, you can take a list of ingredients, and you will know when to add them without having to follow a recipe. Okay, so when you're doing the creaming method, you definitely need a stand mixer. A hand mixer won't work for this. So if you don't have a stand mixer, you cannot do this properly. It essentially starts with a fat and a sugar. So in this case, we're going to use butter, but you can also use shortening, the recipe calls for, and you can also use a brown sugar or any other sugar. Okay, so the temperature of your ingredients is very important as well when using the creaming method. You want to make sure that your butter is room temperature, but a cool room temperature. And you want to make sure that any other ingredients that you're adding, such as your liquid, like if you're adding milk or anything like that, those are also room temperature. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do is take your fat and your sugar and just add it to your mixer, just like this. And you're going to put this on medium and let this mix. Okay, so ultimately, though, you want this to be the texture of wet sand. You shouldn't be able to see any sugar granules in it, but you want it to be light and fluffy, and it will change in color. Okay, so this has been going about almost 10 to 15 minutes on medium speed, and this is the consistency that we want. So you can see that it's the consistency of wet sand. You can't really see any of the sugar in there. And at this point, we're going to add our eggs one at a time while it's on low. And you want to just make sure that your eggs emulsify and just incorporate into this mixture. Okay, so once you've incorporated all of your eggs, at this point, whatever the recipe calls for, you take the rest of your dry ingredients and sift those together separately, and then you take the rest of your wet ingredients and mix those together. And then, alternating, you're going to add your dry ingredients and your wet ingredients, starting with the dry and ending with the dry, to this mixture. Okay, so now that this is all mixed together, this will be your batter that you will bake. And using the creaming method will allow you to take a random list of ingredients and you'll be able to incorporate them and know when to put them into your batter.
Now we have our muffin method. So this is where we're actually going to melt our fats. So say we have butter, then we're going to melt that butter, and then we're actually adding it to the dry ingredients. We're going to be mixing it by hand or using the paddle attachment on our mixer. Things like cornbread, blueberry muffins, pancakes, these are all done using the muffin method.
In this video, we're going to learn about the muffin mixing method. So for any baking method, we're going to start with properly scaled ingredients, which I have scaled out by weight here. So to begin our muffin method, we need to start by sifting our dry ingredients together. So I'm going to use a tammy sieve or a drum sieve for this. Just place this right over top of my bowl. So I'm going to add, from this muffin ratio I'm using, we're going to use flour, sugar, baking powder, salt. Then I'm going to use my bowl scraper and just press the dry ingredients through my sieve. Alright, so I have my dry ingredients sifted together. I'm going to just set this aside. And our next step is going to be to combine all of our liquid ingredients. So that's going to include, for this ratio, our milk, our eggs, and our oil. For this ratio, we're using oil. If I was using butter, I would melt the butter and I would include that in my liquid ratio as well. And lastly, I'll include my vanilla extract. Now I want to use a whisk and just combine all of my liquid ingredients. It's important that we have the liquid ingredients well combined, because in our next step, when we add our liquid to our dry ingredients, we're going to try to mix as little as possible. So if I didn't have my egg well separated into my liquid ingredients, I would have to overmix when I added the liquid to the flour, which would give our muffins a tough consistency. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my liquid ingredients and pour them into my dry. Scrape out my bowl, make sure I have accurate ratio. And I'm just going to mix together my liquid and dry ingredients until all of my flour, all of my dry base is moistened. You're going to see that this is going to be a little bit lumpy, and that's okay. It's better to have this be a little bit lumpy than to overmix it and end up with tough muffins. You can see I'm scraping around the sides of my bowl, making sure I get the bottom so that there's no areas that aren't mixed. Right, so I'm going to go one more motion here. All right, so this is where I'm going to stop mixing at this point. You can see that all of our liquid and dry ingredients have combined together and are well moistened, but there are still some lumps remaining, and that's okay. It's better to have this be a little bit lumpy than to overmix it and end with tough muffins. This is also the point where if I was going to add maybe some fruit or chocolate pieces, whatever it may be, that I would go ahead and add that and mix that in as well.
Lastly, we have the biscuit method. So this is where we're actually going to cut our fat into the flour. We're either going to cut that, physically cutting it into pieces, or we're going to be breaking it down with our fingertips. Your fingertips tend to be cooler than your palms of your hand, so it's always best to use your fingertips if you're doing this method. There are a few other tools as well that we can use, but we're trying to keep this type of mix, this type of a dough, to a very, very crumbly and soft one. Remember, biscuits should not be tough; they should be flaky and very, 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 very soft in nature. So let's take a look at how we produce biscuits, and this can be used for cornbread biscuits methods as well.
The biscuit method is used for biscuits, shortcakes, and scones. The first step is to measure all of your ingredients. Sift your dry ingredients together in a bowl large enough to work in without spilling over. Next, cut in the chilled fat by quickly pinching and tossing it through the dry ingredients. Depending on the product, the fat can be cut in as large as peanuts or as fine as coarse cornmeal. Next, combine the liquid ingredients, including any eggs. Add the liquid ingredients to the dry ingredients, mixing just enough to combine the ingredients. Do not overmix, as this causes toughness and inhibits rise. Place the dough on a lightly floured table. And knead it lightly 5 to 6 times. The dough should be soft and slightly elastic, but not sticky. The dough is now ready for makeup and baking.
So that wraps up our introduction to baking. As you can see, that was just the start, but there's so much just to learn just getting started. It's so far and wide-ranging what we do in baking that it's vast, but it's a lot of fun. There's a lot of science involved, but there's a lot of neat kind of things to be able to play around with to get different results from actually the same ingredients at times. But so if you enjoy this type of thing, there'll be more. But keep on learning. Keep your eyes out and your eyes peeled, listening to more different things that are going on in baking and pastry, and we can continue this adventure later on. I look forward to seeing you all in the kitchen. Cheers.